So here we are, Parshas Vayechi. Happens to be a fast day today, the 10th day of Teves, the day that the Babylonians besieged Jerusalem. But since this is a Parsha class, I'm going to stay focused on the Parsha. So we are approaching the final Parsha of the book of Vayechi. And of course, it starts with Yaakov living 17 years in Egypt. Yaakov gets sick. By the way, Yaakov was the first person, according to our sages, ever to get sick. Until Yaakov's time, a person would reach the age and the day and the moment at which they were supposed to die, and they would die. There was no preparation. There was no time beforehand, no time to say goodbye or anything. And Yaakov was disturbed by that. And he asked Hashem, why is it that you're not giving people a chance to say goodbye? And Hashem said, that's a good idea. I'm going to start with you. And Yaakov was the first one who got sick before he passed away, as a result of which he was able to bless his two grandsons from Yosef, Menashe and Ephraim, famous blessing where he crossed his hands and gave the younger one the greater blessing. And then all his children came to him and he blessed them one by one. And then, as the story goes, he closed his eyes and he passed away. The Egyptians embalmed him and eulogized him. And then Yosef and the brothers brought him back to Israel to be buried with his forefathers in the Ma'arat HaMachpelah in Hebron, which is, of course, where he is still buried today. The brothers came back to Egypt. They were a little bit concerned that Yosef might now take revenge against them for what they did to him. And he reassured them, he promised them everything was going to be fine. And for as long as he was alive, they had a pretty good life in Egypt. The Egyptians didn't make any trouble for them. And the end of the Parsha describes the end of Yosef's life. And these are the two verses that I was going to focus on today. It's towards the end. It's not the actual last verses of the Parsha. Those verses are about Yosef's passing when he was buried in a coffin in the Nile. This is about before that. Vayeshev Yosef b'Mitzrayim hu uveis aviv. Vayechi Yosef mea v'eser shonim. Excuse me for a moment. I just want to quiet my family down a little bit. Okay, sorry about that. So Yosef and his father's household remained in Egypt. Yosef lived 110 years. Let me close down this window. So Yosef, by the way, passed away before all of his brothers. He was the first of the 12 tribes to pass away, even though he was the second to youngest. And the Talmud comments on this, that being in a leadership position is not very good for one's health, because it was a result of his being in that leadership position and perhaps the stress that was involved with that leadership that led him to pass away before all of his brothers. He also passed away, of course, 37 years shy of the time of his father's passing, 70 years shy of his grandfather, 65 of his great-grandfather. So he really lived less than people were used to living in those days. Vayar Yosef le'Ephraim b'nei Shileshim. Gam b'nei Machir ben Menashe yuldu al birkei Yosef. Now it goes on to describe how Yosef kind of got nachas before he passed away. Although he had many years of trouble, but later on in his life, he got nachas. He was the leader of Egypt for 80 years. That's a very long time to be a prime minister. I mean, look at what happened in England lately, where the prime minister lasted, for like 53 days or something. So to be the prime minister in any country for 80 years is certainly a big blessing. But he also got family nachas at that time. Yosef lived to see children of the third generation of Ephraim. Ephraim was, of course, his younger son through Yosef. Sorry, this was Yosef we're talking about. Ephraim was his younger son. So he lived to see children of the third generation of Ephraim. We're talking about Ephraim's great-grandchildren. All right? So he saw great-grandchildren. I mean, it happens, thank God. My grandmother should be well, has a couple of great-grandchildren. So that's what Yosef had. The children of Machir, the son of Menashe, were likewise born upon Yosef's knees. Again, Machir was the son of Menashe, so that was his grandson. And the children of Machir ben Menashe, meaning to say his great-grandchildren, were likewise born upon Yosef's knees. What do you all think that means? The children of his grandson were born upon his knees. I'm going to mute you all if you don't mind, and you're welcome to unmute yourselves if you have questions. So, but this is not a rhetorical question, by the way. What does it mean that the children of Machir, the son of Menashe, were born on Yosef's knees?
Does it mean they had to follow Joseph's, I have a doctor's call, I'm sorry.
No problem. Anybody else?
They instructed them, he passed his wisdom on to them.
Okay. That certainly sounds like something he would do, but how do you fit it into those words?
Well, he's put him on his knee. I heard it correctly. Put it on his knee, and he had him there. He could focus on his knee. Focus on him, on the child.
So it's an expression for him.
An expression, yeah.
It's an expression for him bringing them up, basically.
Yeah.
Having a relationship with them, teaching them. Yeah. That's a good shot. It's a good interpretation. Anybody else? Yes, please, you're muted.
Was it me you're talking to?
I don't know. I'm talking to whoever wanted to talk. I see a few hands are up.
Let them go first.
I believe he had some specific plans to every member of the family. He just wanted to, to spread it between all generations in his family. Hello?
I'm not exactly sure. One more time.
I believe that he was asking God why people are dying without having a specific time to say goodbye, to give his last blessings, but at the same time, maybe to pass on his work, his plans for what to be done. And that's why maybe he needed great grandkids, because he had some specific ideas or goals for them to accomplish.
Okay, I mean, Yaakov is the one who wanted to be able to be sick before he passed away, and he was. So that's a true point. But in terms of Yosef passing on his wisdom to his great-grandchildren, certainly he had unique wisdom to pass on. There's no question about it. He went through a lot, and he knew a lot. He was his father's favorite pupil for when he had time to be his pupil. So he certainly had a lot to pass on to that next generation, certainly. It's actually a very big, it's a really special to receive teaching from past generations, because you can skip a few rungs in the ladder if you get taught by like a grandparent, a great grandparent. You're reaching back, like a few generations earlier, getting direct information without it being kind of filtered through the generations. So it's actually a very big thing. I know my oldest son likes hanging out at my grandma's house, his great grandma, and it's an interesting relationship. They I don't know what they talk about, but they have stuff to talk about. So
yeah, I have it in my family as well too. That's why, to me, it's a personal experience. That's why I believe that, in addition to kind of sharing his wisdom or giving advice, in this particular situation, he was betrayed by his own brothers. That's why maybe he wanted to make sure that in the second and third generation in his family, the message and the plans would be continued. That's my kind of idea.
I hear you. He wanted to make sure the family dynamic was safe and peaceful, as opposed to what he grew up with. I do hear that. David, go ahead. I know you had something.
No, I think Susan was going to say something.
Okay, Susan, go ahead.
It's okay. It's all right. Go ahead, do it, please.
I was thinking that he brought the children up on his knees. Maybe means that he was the sandek that holds the baby during the bris.
Very good. You are absolutely correct. It is one of the interpretations that is coming up. That is coming up.
I want to add something that my grandmother always had us on her knee, and she would sing a Yiddish song. It was like a custom for my brother and myself always to have her sing us that song. It was, I don't know if it was a blessing or I don't know what it was. All I remember being very little, like under 6 years old. My brother was 3, and always we had to get on her knee, and she would say, "Hunja, hunja." I don't know what that means, but that was the start of the song.
Interesting.
Very strange. Anyway,
what was the language? What language was the song in?
I'm guessing it was Yiddish, unless it was Polish. I don't honestly. I don't know, because she was from Poland, but she spoke English.
Interesting. Very interesting. So the interpretations that I have here in the notes that I prepared include 2 interpretations, and we're going to discuss both of them. The second one is what David just mentioned with the Sandik. But the first interpretation is the one that Rashi brings, and that is that it's referring to what Kir, is that how I pronounce your name? Kir?
Abraham.
What Abraham was saying, which is that he was teaching them. Of course, it cannot be taken literally, because Yosef was not a midwife, and therefore they could not literally be born on his knees. So obviously it's an expression. And Rashi says, Al Birke Yosef, born on Yosef's knees, is to be understood as the Targum explains it. He brought them up upon his knees. So actually, I should have included the Rashi in Hebrew, because the translation here that they give for the Rashi is not precise. It's always best to look at the source and get it in the original language, because slight deviation in the translation can actually make a difference in the understanding of the text. So I'm now going to copy and paste the Rashi and put it into the document that I'm sharing with you on the screen. Here goes. So the Rashi, and this is of course in Hebrew and Aramaic, Rashi al Birka Yosef, on the knees of Yosef, Kid Targumai, like the Targum translates it, Gidlon Bain Birkov. He brought them up, Bain Birkov. Who can translate that Hebrew for me? Bain Birkov. I'm sorry?
Between his knees.
Thank you very much. Between his knees. You see the translation that was given here. I don't know who did it in Sefaria.com, but they write upon his knees. The actual words in Rashi is not al birkov, which is actually what the Chumash says, al birka Yosef. Rashi does not write al birkov on his knees. It says bein birkov, between his knees. Because what Rashi is referring to here is not only the way you hold a baby or a small child, which would literally be on your knees, but rather Rashi is referring to the way you educate and bring up and take care of an older child, which you might do literally between your knees. They might be sitting, they might be standing next to you, close to you, and you're educating them. Perhaps you're singing to them, you're sharing with them, they're sharing with you, and so on. This is what Rashi is alluding to, that it was not just the small children of Ephraim that he was educating, it was also the older children of Ephraim. Sorry, Menashe. And not his children, his grandchildren. Again, Gam b'nei Machir ben Menashe, also the sons of Machir, the sons of Menashe, the son of Menashe, right? So it's his great-grandchildren. He was educating them.
Rabbi, I think what you're saying is even more important, that he was not only teaching the smaller children and the medium sized, but he's also teaching the adults at the same time.
Exactly.
It's not, in other words, it has nothing to do with the age, but he was continuously putting forth his knowledge and his like stamp of what it was, how to live to be a good Jew and all that stuff.
Exactly. He never let them go and said, hey, you're 18 now. Go take care of yourself. You don't need me anymore. You're good. He never did that. He continued educating and influencing and teaching, even when they were not children anymore. We see, by the way, the idea of even adults being between the knees in this very parsha. Because if you look at the story of the sons of Yosef that he brings to his father Yaakov to bless before Yaakov passes away, it says he brings them between Yaakov's knees, and he puts Menashe, who is the older son, on Yaakov's right, and Ephraim was the younger son on Yaakov's left, so that Yaakov will put the right hand on the older son and the left hand on the younger son, And of course, as everybody knows, Yaakov switches the hands and he blesses them with his right hand on Ephraim's head and his left hand on Menashe's head. And he explains that even though Menashe will be a father of a great tribe, but Ephraim's tribe will be greater, and so on. And if you picture that story based on the text, you might think we're talking about little children who he's putting between their grandfather's knees. But actually, a simple reading of the timeline will reveal that these children were not less than 19 years old, because they were born before the famine started. And there were 2 years of that famine. And then Yaakov lived in Egypt for another 17 years. So they were at least 19. They could have been older because Joseph got married in the beginning of the 7 good years. So they could have been up till 26, basically, somewhere between 19 and 26. We don't know their age exactly, but they were certainly adults. Nevertheless, they were between his knees because he was, he was on the bed. They were kind of bowing to him, and that's how he was going to bless them. So we see that this expression of being between the knees can apply even to older children. And Rashi changes the wording of the text and says that he brought them up between his knees as opposed to keeping the text on his knees, because he wants to tell you that he continued influencing them when they were older, that he didn't just educate them when they were younger. How does Rashi know this? Rashi knows this because it is actually implicit in the text. In the very text of the verse, if you read it carefully, you will realize that the verse must be talking about Machir ben Menashe's older children and not his younger children. I'm going to go back to the verse on the top of the page. Second verse, sorry. Vayar Yosef leEphraim b'nei Shileshim. Yosef saw to Ephraim sons of the third generation, children of the third generation. So we're talking about Ephraim's great-grandchildren, okay? And that is Yosef's great-great-grandchildren. And again, Ephraim was the younger son. So he saw great-great-grandchildren from his younger son. Now listen carefully. Gam means also, that means something more than that. B'nei Machir ben Menashe, the sons of Machir ben Menashe, Yuldu al Birkei Yosef, were educated on the knees of Yosef. Now, if we're talking about them just being educated when they were young, well, the sons of Machir are just his great-grandchildren. They're not his great-great-grandchildren. So why is that such a big accomplishment? You already said he had great-great-grandchildren from his younger son Ephraim. Not only that, he also had great-grandchildren from his older son. That's not a chiddush. In Talmudic terminology, we use the word chiddush to mean something new. That's nothing new. If you have great-grandchildren from your younger son, well, of course, you're expected to have great-grandchildren, only one great from your older son. What's the big deal? The point is that from his younger son, he saw those great-great-grandchildren. He only saw them, but they did not grow up between his knees because they were babies when he passed away. But from his older son, Menashe, he saw great-grandchildren who grew up between his knees. That means that he brought them up, he educated them, he taught them, and so on. This is all Rashi's first explanation, or I should say Rashi's explanation. We're going to come to the second explanation in a moment. And this ties in with a law in the code of Jewish law, which goes back to the Talmud, and which my father, who should live long, fulfills every week, many times a week, which is that it's an obligation to teach Torah to your grandchildren. Just like there's a special mitzvah to teach Torah to your children, we say that in the Shema every day. V'limadtem oisam es benechem ledaber bam, you should teach it to your children to speak about them. And also we say vishinantam levanecha, you should teach it thoroughly to your children. So not only is it a mitzvah to teach to your children, but it's that mitzvah to teach your grandchildren as well. And this is based on a different verse. It's actually also in the Torah portion of Ve'eschana, which is where the Shema is from, where it says, V'hoidatam levanecha v'livnei vanecha yoim asher amarta lefnei Hashem elekecha b'chorev. You should instruct your children and your grandchildren about the day you stood in front of Hashem at Mount Sinai. Doesn't just mean you tell them about literally standing at Mount Sinai. We cannot say that anymore. We were not there. But it means you should be their link to Mount Sinai. The grandfather is one chain, one link in the chain closer to Sinai than the father. And therefore, it's his obligation to teach his grandchild, not just his child. That is an obligation, of course. That goes without, I mean, it doesn't go without saying. It is explicitly said. But in addition to that, one should make it their business and make the time and the effort and sometimes even the financial commitment to teaching their grandchildren. Because by doing so, you bring them one step closer to Sinai. Every generation is one step closer to Sinai because we received it from our parents, and so on and so forth. So by teaching it to the next generation further removed, you're passing on a closer connection that you have to the event and to Torah and to tradition and so on, passing that on to the next generation. So what Yosef was doing was not only teaching his grandchildren, which is an actual mitzvah in the Shulchan Aruch, it's an obligation according to the Code of Jewish Law, but he continued doing that even to his great-grandchildren. He didn't stop with his children. He continued with his grandchildren, He continued that with his great-grandchildren. And there is also a financial component to this. So I don't know how many of you are grandparents or great-grandparents, but here's the financial component, ladies and gentlemen. According to the Shulchan Aruch, if a person has grandchildren, and those grandchildren need to be taught Torah in a yeshiva, and their parents cannot afford it, it is an obligation upon the grandparents to pay for them to go to yeshiva. Just like it's an obligation on the grandparents to teach them Torah, well, if you don't have the time to actually teach them Torah, or maybe the patience, or maybe the knowledge, or maybe you live somewhere else, or whatever it is, so you can't actually fulfill the obligation to teach them Torah, well, the halacha says you should pay for them to study Torah. Now, of course, that doesn't mean you have to pay completely. Presumably, the parents can pay somewhat, and the school can give a discount and whatnot. All that being true, but there is a specific obligation upon the grandparents to make sure that their children, that their grandchildren get a Torah education. But here is I don't want to say the killer, it's not a killer. Here is the chiddush that we're learning here from Yosef. Yosef took it upon himself not just to teach Torah to his grandchildren, but also to his great-grandchildren. Now, believe me, Yosef was busy. because besides, running the country, he had tons of things to do. And he had his own children to learn with, his own grandchildren to learn with, his own personal affairs. The fact that he took his time to educate his great-grandchildren is because he felt that that was important and that was necessary. Well, if it's necessary, then we should take an example from that, both personally and in terms of financially, if it should be necessary. Okay, yes. Julian, please, you have a question.
Rabbi,
yes.
If your children don't attend a Jewish or yeshiva, are you obliged to support them at a secular university education?
No.
If they need it?
There is no such obligation. There is an obligation upon parents to train their children to be able to make a living. Whether university is the right place for that or not is a different question, but the idea of teaching them a trade and preparing them to be able to be self-supportive is a correct thing for parents. But that in particular is not an obligation upon the grandparents. Of course, it's a nice thing. It's a nice gesture. It helps out your kids. It maybe helps you with the relationship with the grandkids also, knowing that you're caring for them in that way. But it's not an actual obligation.
Thank you.
Sure.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Yeah. The thought was that between his knees might be a euphemism regarding their reproduction choices, that their wives should be just, and that their children's wives should be just.
I mean, I hear what you're saying. It's certainly not the simple interpretation, but I do hear what you're saying. And Yosef, of course, was very careful about the organ between his knees. He's the paradigm of morality and purity in terms of the situation that he was in and how he refrained. And he's an example for all of us. So there's no question about that. So you're saying he was imparting that lesson to that about matters of between the knees. I mean, I hear you. I can't say it's the simple pshat, but I'm open to it. Yes. Yes. Anybody else? Questions? No. Okay. So,
Rabbi, I just want to make a comment.
yes.
This is not simple. This goes way beyond. This is something I had no idea how complicated. This is just amazing.
I lost you.
I said I had no idea how complicated this section was. When I first read it after I printed it, I thought, well, I wonder what this really is about. I couldn't really make sense of it.
Yes.
Now, after all this discussion, this is a lot more complicated than not just between his knees or on his knees, or, this is way more.
Yes.
Way more than what I imagined.
Yes. I left the topic as a mystery. I didn't spell it out, but yes, thank you. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the next interpretation, which is the Targum Yonatan ben Uziel. The Targum Yonatan ben Uziel is a translation rendered by Yonatan ben Uziel, which is why it's called Yonatan ben Uziel. Yonatan, for your information, was the top student of Hillel HaZaken, Hillel the Elder. Hillel the Elder was the sage who became, his family became the leaders of the Jewish people for several centuries. His son was Rabban Gamliel HaZaken, the elder Rabban Gamliel, whose son was Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, whose son was Rabban Gamliel, And it went on in that family for many generations. Hillel had 80 students, according to the Talmud. And the Talmud describes what the top 20 were like, what the bottom 20 were like. Anyway, Yonatan ben Uziel was his top student. The Talmud says that his holiness was so intense that if a bird were to fly over him while he was studying, the bird would get singed. It would literally get burned from the intense holiness that was emanating from Rabbi Yonatan. So his translation of the Torah is a little bit different than the translation of Onkelos. Onkelos was a convert who transcribed the Aramaic translation of the Torah, which is called Targum Onkelos, the translation of Onkelos. And you can find that in most Chumashim printed alongside the Hebrew. That was the standard translation of the Torah and the Chumash for many centuries. Aramaic was the vernacular. And if you could read Aramaic, you could understand the Torah, even if you didn't read Hebrew. And that translation of Onkelos is much more on the level of Pshat. Pshat means basic interpretation, simple interpretation. The translation of Yonatan is much more medrash. That means it's not a simple translation, but he adds in interpretations from our sages that are not explicit in the text. So it's much less literal. It's much more on the level of drush than pshat. It's not the simple interpretation, it's more of the rabbinic perspective. Okay, so here is the Targum Yonatan. I have it here in the Aramaic. Of course, the Aramaic that it's written in has Hebrew letters. So it's not the actual Aramaic alphabet. It's the Hebrew alphabet with Aramaic words. Kind of like Yiddish is based on German. It's a dialect of German, but we don't write it in German, alphabet. We write it in Hebrew characters. So here goes. Vachama Yosef leEphraim benin dorin tlisoin. That's pretty much the same. Yosef saw to Ephraim sons of the third generation. Uf b'nei Machir bar Menashe. Also the sons of Machir, the son of Menashe, kad isyelidu, when they were born, gezirinun Yosef, they were circumcised by Yosef. The simple understanding of the Targum Yonasan is that he was their moil, not their sandik, as was previously suggested, but their moil. However, some interpret Yonasan to mean that it doesn't mean literally he was their moil, but rather they were on his knees during the bris, which is exactly what we call a sandik. The sandik has the baby on his knees during the bris, while the moil performs the bris. Yosef was the sandik for the sons of Machir ben Menashe, for his great-grandchildren. Okay, what is the significance of that? Let's have some input here, because I'm talking for too long.
I think it's to make sure that the child does not move, keep the child calm. That's why you give him a bissel of wine at the same time while the moil is doing what the moil does.
I have seen that. I have seen the wine. Seems like a bit of a trick, but yes, I see them do that all the time. And yeah, it is nice to be held so that you're kind of being, embraced, even though it's painful, I'm sure, a little bit. I don't
Yes.
know.
Neither do I.
Yeah.
But you want to make sure that the baby does not move while that is being performed, because otherwise the male might do some irreparable damage.
Yes, that's true. The sandik is definitely instructed to hold the baby tight.
There's something else also. Joseph, I'm sure, was blessing and saying prayers at the same time that he was holding the baby. In other words, he was getting the baby's attention and trying to have the baby look at him in his face so that the baby wouldn't really pay attention to what was happening below, what was happening. In other words, they always start with getting the baby to join, to be in the ceremony, not just bring the baby and do it. No, it's never like that. It's always very slowly, and you bring the baby to the point of being involved in the ceremony.
Well, the baby is a huge part of the ceremony, no question about it. Whether the baby knows it or not, that I couldn't tell you. But
I really believe the consciousness of the baby is very important at that time. Very important.
Well, I'm sure they know something on some level. There's no question that they know something. So actually, yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Rabbi. I was going to say,
please.
I don't believe the child is conscious of what is happening. Yes, he may cry because, yes, it is somewhat painful, but he won't remember him having the foreskin being eliminated.
Right. There's not going to be a conscious memory. Speaking of my grandmother, actually, she told me that when she was like 6 or 7, she used to dream that she was going through a tunnel, which was getting more and more narrow. And then she would wake up screaming, and she's sure that she was dreaming of her birth and going through the birth canal. So anyway.
That is possible. That is possible.
Why not?
So,
I used to be a medic, and yes, I've seen a lot of circumcisions. I've assisted in a few circumcisions, let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously, everyone that I've been to, even the Shabbat services, like my rabbi just had, well, not him, but his wife had, the Rebbeson had a boy about 3 months ago, I'd say now.
Who's that?
Yankee Dunberg.
Oh, nice. Very nice.
And of course, his father, Yossi Dunberg, did the holding and everything. And
nice.
I don't believe, though, that at that point they gave the baby any wine, although I don't remember, to be honest with you.
So,
but generally,
you mentioned the one earlier. Actually, the official custom is to give the baby wine when they say after the bris, "B'damayich chayi." You should live by your blood, and the wine, which is presumably red, represents the blood, and the baby gets a bit of the wine. So, many moyalim will give the baby wine beforehand just to calm him down, but
exactly,
the official custom is afterwards.
Rabbi, what does that mean, live by your blood? What does that mean?
I'm not really sure, but I'm guessing it means that we sometimes have to go through the pain of whatever a difficulty might entail, but that pain makes us stronger. So we just went through a circumcision. It's not an easy thing, but we live with it. That brings us to a closer relationship with Hashem. No pain, no gain, as they say.
That's it.
So one of the points of being a sandik is to emphasize that the bris is not a clinical procedure. It's not a circumcision that we're doing for medical reasons, that we want for the baby's health and whatnot. It's a religious ritual, and the knees of the sandik actually represent an altar, like a mizbeach, like an altar, and we're actually offering the baby to Hashem. Obviously, the baby's staying alive, but the fact that we're drawing some of the blood of the baby means we are devoting this baby to Hashem, and we're doing it on an altar which the knees of that person represents. So the sandik is not a small job. It's not just to hold the baby down, although he does that too, but it's to represent an altar of God. According to the code of Jewish law, you know how we prepare a chair for Elijah the prophet? By a bris? It's called Kisei Shel Eliyahu, the chair of Elijah. Well, Elijah is going to have to sit next to the sandik. So in order to make sure that Elijah is comfortable to sit next to the sandik, you want to choose a good Jew to be the sandik. You don't want to choose a troublemaker, a bank robber, or any other person of ill repute. You want to choose
that leaves me out. Sorry, Rabbi, I couldn't resist it.
That's okay. So, this is why, of course, they honored Yosef, who was a great tzaddik. So it's appropriate that they should give him that honor of being the tzaddik for his great grandfather. So there is a halachic ramification of this Targum Yonatan, of this translation of Yonatan. Just like we had a halachic ramification of Rashi's interpretation, and we learned from it that a great-grandfather should make it their business to teach Torah to their great-grandchildren if they are able to, or support their Torah learning financially if they're able to. Well, here comes a halachic ramification of the Targum Yonatan. Okay, so there is a custom, and it's an ancient custom that goes back several centuries, that one should not honor the same person twice to be a sandik for two siblings. I'm going to repeat that. One father should not honor the same person twice to be the sandik for his children. So Baruch Hashem, thank God, I was blessed with 6 boys, and each of the boys had a different sandik. My father and father-in-law, they should be well. Myself, I did one as well. Rabbi Weberman should rest in peace. Rabbi Shapiro, who should live long, as well as Sammy Rohr, who should rest in peace. Those were the sandiks of my children. Each of them different people. Never was it the same person twice.
Why is that, Rabbi? Why is that so important?
So the idea is that being a sandik is considered a very great honor, and it's also associated with a blessing for wealth. That a person who is a sandik will be blessed with wealth. I never followed up with any of my sandiks to find out if they won the lottery. Well, Sammy Rohr was already very wealthy, so that was that. But I'm not aware. Actually, you know what? I asked Rabbi Weberman once about it, and he said, of course, I'm so wealthy. And he started naming me all his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And that's true wealth. So he felt that the blessing was fulfilled. But the point is that because of a big blessing, we want to share it with many people and not keep it with only one person. And this is actually similar to the Ketoret, which is a incense offering, was offered in the Beis Hamikdash, that was traditionally also associated with the blessing of wealth. And only one Kohen, once a Kohen got that opportunity to offer the Ketoret, he could never get that opportunity again. In the Beis Hamikdash, the way it worked is that there was a lottery in the beginning of every day to determine who would sacrifice each sacrifice. Before they did the lottery for the Ketoret, they said, Chadashim Liktoras, only new people for the Ketoras are eligible for this lottery, because if you ever did it even once in your life, you were not eligible to do it again. So the Sandik honor is similar to the Ketoret, and it is only given within each family only once to each person.
A question about the Sandak.
Yes.
I have read, and I had been told, that the Sandak also is the godfather, or can be a godfather, for the child. And what about the status of a godfather within Judaism?
That's a good question. I have heard that said about a Sandik, that the Sandik is considered like a spiritual father of the child. And that's another reason why you want to choose a good Sandik, who will be a good example for the child. I've never heard of it entailing any specific obligation or any specific relationship or anything like that. Just more of a kind of spiritual connection, that the Sandik is like a father, but I haven't really heard that people follow up about that and say, oh, he's your Sandik, you should learn with him, you should speak to him, I've never heard that done.
Bar mitzvah checks.
I'm sorry?
Bar mitzvah checks.
Bar mitzvah checks, exactly. That's one thing they're good for. Remind them at the time of the bar mitzvah that they were the Sandik. So yes. But yeah, there is something to that. Actually, the word for the person who brings in the baby in Yiddish is called a kvater. And I've heard that word comes from kefater, like a father. And that it used to be that the person who brought in the baby would also hold the baby. And that this idea of the being like the father was originally intended for the Sandik, not for the kvater. So there is truth to that, but I don't know exactly how we express that truth, to be honest. So coming back to Yosef, the question can be asked. Here it says the sons.
You close the door there, it's not.
I'm going to mute you, Avram, if you don't mind, but you can unmute yourself if needed. Here it says that the sons, plural, of Machir ben Menashe were circumcised on the knees of Yosef, meaning to say he was the Sandik. Well, it seems to be meaning that more than one son, that he was the Sandik for more than one son, when according to tradition, he should have refused the honor after the first time. This is a question that the Rebbe asks. Let's see if any of you can come up with his interpretation, which is based on a Chassam Sofer, and a teaching of Rabbi Moshe Sofer. So here's what he says. Rabbi Moshe Sofer, the Chassam Sofer, says that just like by Ketoret, it was only a individual, regular, standard Kohen who could not perform the Ketoret ceremony twice. The Kohen Gadol, on the other hand, because he was the holiest Kohen, he could do it as many times as he wanted to, because he was a tzaddik of a different stature altogether. So it was an honor for him to do it more than once. And here the Chassam Sofer says that the same thing applies to a sandik. A regular person should not be honored to be the sandik twice in one family. But a tzaddik, like for example, the rabbi of the community, or a Hasidic Rebbe, a leader, perhaps a Rosh Yeshiva, somebody like a great leader in a generation, he could be honored more than once. Because in that case, the baby is being honored. It's not that we're honoring the person to be the sandik. The baby is being honored by being given this special person to be the sandik once again. So this is why Yosef took time out of his busy schedule to be the sandik more than once for the children of Macher ben Menashe, because he was certainly the tzaddik of that generation. All right, should we round up and give a short synopsis? David, you ready?
Yes.
All right, so the synopsis is that Yosef lived a long life. He lived to see great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren. The great-great-grandchildren were young when he passed away, but the great-grandchildren were already older, and he had taken the time to bring them up, to educate them, to pass on to them the Torah that he learned, the experiences that he had, and certainly that was a special learning that they had with him that could not be replicated by their own parents or grandparents. And we also learned that he took the time to be the sandik at the brisson of his great-grandchildren, even more than once in a family, and the importance of being a sandik, and how usually we don't honor the same person twice, but for a tzaddik we do. And Yosef being the tzaddik, he received that honor more than once. So that's the lesson.
It's a good lesson.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, baby.
Good to see you all.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Goodbye.
Rabbi. Bye all.
My pleasure. See you next week, God willing.
Thank you.
Have a good Shabbos. Next week we start Chumash Shemos.
And a good week, everybody.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.